Hello, my name is Charles Delusnior, Global Communications Director for the International Fragrance Association. Welcome to this IFRA webinar on preparing for IFRA's revised policy on furocoumarins. This is a public webinar IFRA is hosting for all interested stakeholders. Thank you for joining us today. As you know, IFRA has been working for some time on updating its policy on furocoumarins in natural complex substances. This revised policy will likely be included in the next regular amendment to the IFRA Standards in the form of a revised standard. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. This webinar is recorded and it will be sent to all registrants after the event has taken place. There will be a Q&A at the end of the session, so at the end. So please do not hesitate to leave your questions in the Q&A section down below. Quick reminder, don't use the chat function for the Q&A because this chat function is only for talking to other participants and asking technical questions if you can't hear anything, for example. The Q&A is for where you should leave your Q&As and they will be dealt with at the end. Now, with the housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to introduce our star speakers for today. These are Matthias Vey, Vice President for Scientific Affairs at IFRA, Jennifer Dortz, Scientific and Regulatory Affairs Manager for IFRA, and finally Jennifer Kochiara of DSM-Firmenich, who is Chair of the IFRA Risk Management Task Force. Thank you all for attending. We do very much appreciate it. We've got good attendance today. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Matthias for his introduction to the furocoumarins policy. Thank you and have an excellent webinar.
Thank you very much, Charles, for the nice introduction. A warm welcome also from my end to all the participants. We are quite impressed by the interest in the webinar, and I hope we will be able to deliver on the expectations. Let me shortly introduce what you're going to hear this afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you are located. So there will be 3 parts of the presentation. I have the honor to start with introducing the background of why we did work on the policy and how the new policy is going to look like. Then my colleague Jennifer will follow on how this is going to translate into a standard, how the standard actually is going to look like. And then our colleague Jennifer from DSM-Firmenich will explain how it's going to translate in practice into the daily application when it comes to producing certificates to communicate along the supply chain. So let me start with providing the background on our revised policy on the furocoumarins. Next slide. Let me start with providing a little bit of information on how the regulatory situation looks like and how this compares to the current IFRA policy on furocoumarins. So there is a number of key legislative pieces out there. The major maybe being the EU regulation, which sets a 1 ppm limit in so-called sun protection and bronzing products. You have the entry 358 in the Annex 2, the Annex of Prohibited Materials, but it allows a certain trace amount of furocoumarins in these products. Again, it's a 1 ppm limit. You have a similar entry in the Asian Cosmetic Directive. It's actually, if I'm allowed to say, a copy and paste. And the reason for this is phototoxicity and potential photogenotoxicity of some of the furocoumarins. And in the legislation, you have 2 markers, 5-MOP and 8-MOP, that are of certain relevance when it comes to presence in materials we use. There's also a legislation in Switzerland. It was introduced much later in 2017, and it's slightly different when it comes to the text and the requirements, because it sets a 1 ppm limit in all type of cosmetic products that can be exposed to sunlight. And there is a guidance document that provides some clarifications on what's in and what's out. And 2 examples for what is not falling under this limit are fine fragrance and deodorants. Last but not least, the current IFRA furocoumarin policy sets a limit of 15 ppm for 5-MOP, so for 1 marker in UV exposed products. And there's also a number of individual standards that set restrictions if there is no information on the furocoumarin level. For example, we have individual standards in place for bergamot oil expressed or bitter orange oil expressed. Next slide. So what are we talking about? What is the subject in the scope of the policy? It's the furocoumarins, which are naturally present in, as you know, several citrus oils and some other natural complex substances, which are widely used as fragrance ingredients in fragrance creations. They are not for use as such, and there's no reason to use them as such. So they are prohibited for use as such, but we have their presence, and the concern, as mentioned before, is due to their toxicological profile when it comes to phototoxic reactions. Fully understanding the impact that any change in a policy has along the supply chain, we have established in 2018 what we call the IFRA Furocoumarin Stakeholder Group, starting from the beginning to work with participants and representatives all along the supply chain on how this change in the policy could look like, what a reasonable change will be, and to find alignment on this policy as best as we could from the beginning. So we have representatives from the NCS producing industry, from the fragrance industry, from what we call the customer industry, so the clients, the users of the fragrance mixtures, as well certainly as our research partner, the Research Institute for Fragrance Materials, RIFM. And this ongoing work has now led to a proposal for a new policy as basis for an IFRA standard we are happy to present to you today. Next slide. What did lead us or what did support us in coming to this policy proposal was mainly three work streams. At the very beginning, we started with developing and validating an analytical method that would then be accessible to regulators in the industry, actually permitting the quantification of individual furocoumarins in different matrices. And that has been done some years ago and is publicly available, for example, on the IFRA website. The second focus was the identification of what we would consider relevant markers, furocoumarin markers. There's a wide variety of furocoumarins out there, and as in any good regulatory approach, and in our case, a voluntary regulatory approach, it makes sense to identify relevant markers that then help in implementing the policy. And we have had a dedicated working group on this. Finally, we had a work stream establishing the best weight of evidence in support of the maximum thresholds we would put in our policy for those respective markers in finished consumer products. Next slide. So here is now how the policy is going to look like. We have identified a total of 8 markers, which in any combination would then be the basis for defining the limits or quantifying the limits. You have these 8 markers here, and you will find 2 of them already being present in regulation, 5 and 8 MOP. And for the other ones, we have developed a rationale why they should be used as markers, and that rationale is available and will be shared. The policy itself is going to set a 1 ppm limit in line with existing regulations. That was also a starting point from the beginning, that we try to be aligned as best as possible in our policy with existing regulation, which makes implementation much easier. So we have a 1 ppm limit for UV exposed products. We have a 5 ppm limit for other leave-on products. We have a 50 ppm limit for rinse-off products. And we have no limit where there is no skin contact or no UV exposure. When it comes to the 1 ppm limit, we also try to precisely define which product should be in scope and which product should be out of scope. And in this furocoumarin stakeholder group, we agreed that it would be either the presentation of the product that would clearly make it part to fall in this 1 ppm limit, and very likely it will be the SPF on a product that decides whether the product is in or out of scope. So any product carrying a sun protection factor, an SPF, is in scope of the 1 ppm limit. Next slide. With this revised policy, you can imagine that we have to undergo reviews and support for the policy. So our key partner when it comes to scientific expertise is still the expert panel for fragrance safety. And we have therefore reached out and found support by the expert panel for fragrance safety on this proposed policy, which was developed inside the industry, which is not the normal way. As you know, for other standards, they are based on the rhythm safety assessment, but because here we are not talking of actively used ingredients, but unwanted presence of, let's call it, impurities, we developed the policy, but we have it reviewed by the expert panel for fragrance safety. I was talking about the rationale before in the scientific support of the 5 ppm threshold limit, and we have prepared and submitted this evidence for a publication, and we are currently awaiting feedback from the journal on this publication, which should then be the publicly available basis for the standard and the standard rationale. And certainly in the development of the policy along going forward, we had the full support of this furocoumarins stakeholder group, which is why we had established it from the beginning, but also the IFRA Risk Management Task Force, which is a responsible committee inside the IFRA structure in support of risk management activities. And we have also reached out to one of our key downstream partners, Cosmetics Europe, and we expressed this policy and found support by the Cosmetics Europe expert team, Perfumery. So we feel we are in good shape in now moving forward with the implementation of this policy. Next slide. We wanted to point out some specific activities linked to Switzerland, and the Swiss regulators had been quite interested in the IFRA furocoumarin policy since some time. They had reached out to us after the 49th Amendment when and how there would be an update of our policy. So we had been in dialogue with them since then and actually shared also our rationale for the markers as well as for the maximum use levels with them. And as a good thing or as a positive feedback, we can report that we found agreement on our marker selection, which has been shared with the Swiss authorities and was adopted, and is very likely also to be reflected in a revised version of the Swiss cosmetic regulation. Where we couldn't find full support, was our rationale for the second skin contact level, but that is as things are. So we are happy that we have alignment on one element of the policy, and we will see how the reflection on the second element will go once we are actually going public with our new policy in form of a standard. Next slide. Last slide from my end. Just to let you know on some regulatory developments related to all these activities. As you might know, the Cassis de Dijon principle has been lifted for the furocoumarin containing cosmetic products. The Cassis de Dijon principle actually means that products in line with European legislation, even though not in line with Swiss regulation, can still be marketed. And unfortunately, from our perspective, for the furocoumarin policy, this has been lifted. The respective ordinance became effective on February 1st, 2024, and not compliant cosmetic products can still be imported until 31st of December 2025, so end of this year, but they can remain in the market until depletion of stock. So we just wanted to point this out because it's important for the trade when it comes to Switzerland, and because of the high interest of the Swiss regulators in our policy development, we felt it relevant to share this information. And this is the moment, next slide, where I would now actually hand over to my colleague Jennifer Dodds to explain to you how this policy is going to be transferred into the form of an IFRA standard.
So, hello everyone. Thank you, Matthias, for giving me the floor to talk to you about the expected changes at the standard level. So currently, as shown here on the slide, several standards address the phototoxicity potential of furocoumarins present in certain natural complex substances. The table displayed come from the current guidance document, which is available on the IFRA website. But this situation will change with the next regular amendment to the IFRA standard. So let's now look at the changes management. Two main updates will occur. First, the removal of 8 standards for individual oils without specific bergaptan levels, such as bergamot or expressed grapefruit oil. And secondly, the current standard known as citrus oil and other furocoumarin containing essential oils will be renamed to furocoumarin in natural complex substances and will reflect the revised policy that Matthias just presented to you. Of course, further details on these changes will be provided in the revised version of the guidance for the use of the IFRA standard, which will be published along with the 52nd amendment. So now let's look at this revised standard in more depth over the next few slides. As I mentioned, the standard will be renamed to furocoumarins in natural complex substances. The standard will include the CAS number of the 8 key markers, listing a generic CAS number, followed by the names and the synonym of these markers. There will also be an historical overview of the standard, noting the name change and the implementation dates. Then this is a restriction standard with specified limit. And as Matthias explained, for finished product, the limits include 3 maximum threshold for skin contact product, 1 or 5 ppm for leave-on product, and 50 ppm for rinse-off product. The notebox, will clarify the situation where the 1 ppm level applies, along with details on the revised policy. And last but not least, the annex on contribution from other sources will also include typical levels of the 8 furocoumarin marker within a non-exhaustive indicative list of NCSs that are commonly used in the fragrance industry. And now I will hand over to Jennifer for the last part of this webinar about the IFRA Certificate of Conformity of Fragrance Mixture with IFRA Standards.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Hopefully sounds okay. Great. We can move over to the next slide, please. So what we wanted to open up with here is that within the Risk Management Task Force, we put together a subgroup of experts to discuss the upcoming policy and the revised standard, and what does this mean from an implementation standpoint. We really wanted to focus on preparing a practical example to make the change management go as smoothly as possible. So we did spend a lot of time kind of discussing the revised policy and if it would cause basically leading to further splitting the IFRA categories. Many of you may be aware that we have 18 different categories today. So a lot of what we discussed was, would a change like this lead to splitting those categories or not? And as we were discussing this, we said, well, let's take a look at what happens today. And within the guidance document that is distributed with each amendment to the Code of Practice, there is an existing statement about sunscreens. And I'll just use that word loosely because that's in the context of the current verbiage. And basically, products that contain UV filters, they are not listed out separately, but they are included with the appropriate major product type. So an example would be a lip cream that contains a sunscreen would be included with other lip products in category 1. So we were, in our discussions, we're saying, well, maybe we can retain that policy and what else could we look at with our tools today to kind of leverage this? And so ultimately, again, with 18 categories and the potential to be, not exactly duplicating, but to go a bit higher, category 1, you would say, okay, if you had lip products, traditional lip products, colored lipsticks, maybe that becomes 1A, and then a lip product with sunscreen would become 1B. And if you thought about another category, say category 5, you've got body care products, face products, hand products. If you went 5A, B, C, D to expand to E, F, G, and H, it would become very complicated to manage. So with that, we really wish to avoid those added complexities and retain the current habits and practices today that, again, that each product type is listed with its major product type. And then we said, well, why don't we look at the IFRA certificate as an opportunity to communicate the compliance and kind of leverage this a bit. And basically what we did, we looked at this other mechanism for communication. And we did come up with 2 draft templates that we're pleased to share today. I think we can move to the next slide. Okay, so what here is just a quick view. Now, please allow me a moment before we start looking at some of the numbers. Just a general reminder is that IFRA as a body does not provide any certificates of compliance to the IFRA standards. However, there needs to be this ongoing relationship between the fragrance houses and the customer companies about communicating the overall compliance, right? We want our consumer good companies to be confident that the fragrances are conforming with the IFRA standards. So IFRA in the guidance document does have an example certificate template that can be used. It's not completely mandatory. The format, the style can vary between fragrance house and in communications with the customers. But we did have a starting point with a sample template. And what you see on the left here is an example of a multi-category approach where using the current example template that is in the guidance document. And we sort of expanded upon it, introducing a column next to the primary data. So what you see, and the areas highlighted green would indicate new details related to implementing this new standard. So we had a proposed text on the top of the first column to refer to the usual maximum level of use. So this would represent your standard non-UV protected products. So what we have here, these numbers are connected to actual data points, which will be on the next slide in case anyone ever wants to validate. So we would have the values that are the maximum use levels without the presence of furocoumarins. And then in the column next to it, you would have a comparison table that says if the furocoumarins are present And they lead to a level that the 1 ppm limit would be more restrictive, that you see that second level right next to the column. So in this example here, the first one on the left, with the side-by-side, if you have a lip project that there's development between a fragrance house and a customer company, you could see perhaps in this particular example, the maximum use level, if it's a standard lip color, that would be 3.33%. However, if it was going to be containing, have any SPF or be marketed for sun protection, you would need to consider that additional level for the furocoumarins, and its maximum use level would actually be 0.66%. So you're getting that view in the same document, both with and without, depending on how the product is marketed. So then again, we did select some sample verbiage on the column header, referring to the maximum level of use in products with UV light protection. Right. So this is one view that we could do a comparison. Now, we also know, again, the fact that there's variability in the IFRA standard. So again, there's the requirement to communicate the compliance. The style in which that is communicated can vary from fragrance house to fragrance house. So we did work on a second template as well, where the data are expressed a little bit differently. So in this, we're adding additional rows. So you have one consistent column looking down. And in this case, we're seeing that the category number is where some of the details are described. So category one, for UV protection products. So with this, we really felt that this would be a good way forward because it does respect current habits and practices and gives a little bit of flexibility as well. So with that being said, Jennifer, actually, next slide, please. So the data points in the scroll on the side are the actual data points that were used to come up with those values. So again, I took a sample formulation in which the concentrated fragrance oil has a total furocoumarin content using the 8 markers of 0.015%. And then I recapped at the bottom, again, what those new levels look like. Leave-on products 5 ppm, the leave-on products with UV light protection 1 ppm, and rinse-off products with 50 ppm. So what you see on the right here is a continuation of the example IFRA certificate. And I just did a little bit of cut and paste here because I wanted to highlight things that were changes. So we would strongly recommend that for all templates communicating compliance to the IFRA Code of Practice, that this additional footnote recapping the 1 ppm limit for furocoumarins is built into the template that is used. And then again, there's the optional information. Should the exchange of information involve the precise level of IFRA restricted materials, this would be the place in which that could be communicated. So as you know, the furocoumarins, we have 8 markers. The flexibility on the CAS numbers would also be open. The main point, obviously, the standard is going to limit the group, the total combination of those 8 furocoumarins. So that's why the single value of 0.015% as a total of furocoumarins is the most relevant detail to exchange. Okay, we can go over to the next slide. So what we wanted to do here, we have a few practical examples of what this could look like. And again, remember, our IFRA certificates can be a single category approach, so very custom tailored for the exact fragrance creation and final consumer product, or it could be a more general document with multi-categories. So I'm focusing here a few case studies on common examples and what the impact of this would reflect. So in this first example, I'm also using the same sample formulation in which the furocoumarin content is 0.015%. And again, we've got the recap of the values. Thank you. So here we would say, okay, so for category 1, again, I discussed this a little bit earlier, for a traditional colored lip product, the usual maximum level of use would be 3.3%. However, if your lip brief is specifically something that has an SPF, you need to take into consideration that lower level, the 1 ppm cutoff. And in that case, the maximum use level is 0.66. So it's the same fragrance formula, just the maximum use levels expressed two different ways. On the left, not considering the only considering the furocoumarin general leave-on product, but on the right, considering that additional 1 ppm cutoff that would be necessary for the UV light protection. Okay, and again, I just recapped that little footnote at the bottom just as a reminder. So now I'll stick with the same case study, but now let's look at an example where perhaps the fragrance formulation that has been developed is limited by other IFRA restricted materials. What would that look like in our IFRA certificate? So in this example formulation, there's no furocoumarins content. There's no furocoumarin content at all. But we do have another IFRA restricted material, benzaldehyde, at 2%. So I've recapped from the IFRA standard on benzaldehyde, the maximum use level in category 1 being 0.045%. And then we determined that the maximum use level of that particular fragrance oil for that intended use is 2.25%. And that value can be displayed in both columns, because even if you do have a submission that would be for UV light protection, there's no furocoumarins to take into account. So the IFRA maximum is exactly the same with those two conditions. Okay. So sticking with this story, we have a third case study where your formula has furocoumarins, but perhaps furocoumarins and another IFRA restricted material, and perhaps there's impact across the way that. So we've got one example where the furocoumarin content is contributing to a situation for category 1 that the maximum use level would be 3.33% in those normal products. And the case of the 1 ppm cutoff, the 0.66. But now we see that benzaldehyde level would give us a maximum use level of 2.25%. So in the IFRA certificate, we would have to take the most restrictive of the two. So you see our reporting for category 1 under the normal product types, the usual product types, would actually be 2.25%. And in this case, the trigger is benzaldehyde. But when we look at the corresponding UV protected product, it is actually the furocoumarins that are more restrictive. So really what we wanted to highlight here is that awareness that you could have two different values across a category number being driven by two different IFRA restricted materials. Okay, so it's just to highlight some of the complexities, which again, we've tried to streamline in the form of the communication tool. Okay. It's just two more case studies to pull on product types where this could also be very common. In the case of perhaps facial makeup, we know some products are formulated as is. Some products will be marketed with SPF, have additional sun protection factor. So we kind of looked at the same sample raw materials, but now we're switching from category 1 over to category 3. Okay, see the table. So in this particular example, we see that the furocoumarin content is the most restrictive for both scenarios. Okay, and our last case study, another common application would cover things like body and face cream and our very traditional sunscreens. So again, I tried to keep the samples very clean with same raw materials and values. Just where we're seeing the differences would be in the category maximum use levels. So in this particular example, we would see that for category 5A and 5B, again covering body and face, that the maximum use level would be triggered by benzaldehyde at 3.2%. But if those body lotions and or face creams contained UV protection, that the maximum use level would be 0.66%. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you, Matthias, and the other Jennifer as well for your input today. We are getting a few questions, and now would be the opportunity for you to any participants watching who wish to ask questions to actually insert them into the Q&A box down below. But we already have 4, so why don't we start with the ones we already have, and then we can run from there. We'll start with an easy one that came up during an earlier part of the conversation. So why don't we run with the one from Sophie Regazzoni, who asks very simply, hello, when can we expect the publication of the 52nd amendment?
Could I take that? Yeah, we could.
Yes, Jennifer, I think that's you.
So we are currently working on the preparation of the 52nd amendment, and the planning is to launch the consultation, the public consultation, at the end of 2025. So the notification is expected mid 2026. That's the plan at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very clear. Okay, an earlier question as well was, do furocoumarins apply only to skincare products, or is it present in other product types? Does it apply to other product types as well? I think, Matthias, this is probably one for you.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that on. Well, it applies to all products, and I think that's what hopefully came out of the presentation. In the scope of the IFRA standards, so this implies skincare and other products, but I think the impact, if I'm allowed to say, will only be on products where you have a skin contact. So it will kind of in secondary result, but the policy is going to apply to all kinds of products, but the impact will only be on skincare products. But skincare product, no, not skincare products, skin contact products. So that can be cosmetic products, but that can also be household and detergent products for which there's a certain likeliness for skin contact. So only skincare products, the answer is no. Skin contact products, the answer is yes, and then it depends on the type and the amount. So is it leave-on, is it rinse-off, and stuff like that. But we will definitely make that clear in the way the standard is designed and in the explanatory documents.
Thank you very much, Matthias. A corollary to this question is one from Christophe Chevalier, who asks, are skincare or colored lip products bearing SPF for the purpose of claiming an anti-aging activity in the scope of the 1 part per million limit? If no, did you plan to clarify the wording in the IFRA booklet to explicitly exclude these products that bear an SPF for the purpose of claiming an anti-aging activity? I think it might be a follow-up, but it could be either of you.
Yeah,
Please.
I can try to give that a go, but I'm really also looking at my colleagues maybe to back me up. I think this is a complexity or refinement that we will not address. We have to deal with things that are easily applicable and implementable. And one of the basic decisions was an SPF will include the assumption of consumers that they can use this product exposed to sunshine, and therefore it will have the stronger limit. I think anything going beyond will become too complex and also open the doors for misunderstanding and misinterpretation. But I'm looking also at the two Jennifers if they would agree with my statement or maybe want to add on it.
I agree in the principle that a product that is marketed with SPF could be used by a consumer for the purpose of protection. The assumption, it is definitely a complexity. I think there could be a lot of discussion back and forth between the consumer goods company and the fragrance house, I guess with agreement about what's in and out of scope, perhaps what additional use instructions could be included on the product. There might be a detail that is better managed directly between the fragrance house and the consumer goods company in that very specific case.
Yeah, and I would just maybe then come, and I fully agree, and I would come back then maybe to the statement that what we have and what we always look at is the intended and the foreseeable.
Foreseeable.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, then one which might be a little bit easier, or maybe. Uh, the typical retention of a rinse-off product is 1%, while the retention of a leave-on product is usually considered to be 100%. What is the basis for deciding a lower ratio of 10 between other leave-on products, 5 parts per million, and rinse-off products, 50 parts per million? Thank you.
It's the existing way we have defined the difference between leave-on and rinse-off. It has been and will remain a factor of 10. That's a simple answer I could give. Like for any other already existing standards on phototoxic materials we have out there, and it's a policy that has been agreed and is supported by the expert panel. So it's not for us to challenge it, but it's in line with all the other existing phototox standards out there.
Thank you very much. Now another one from Magali Guyot. How can we anticipate the need to update the information on the raw materials we supply to the cosmetics industry if the method of analysis is given at the same time as the 52nd Amendment?
I can take that on. Actually, the analytical method for the furocoumarins has been established in 2013. So it's already out for a couple of years, and it's available on the IFRA website. So it was really the first start, if I'm not wrong, when we decided to revise the policy. The first thing, it was the first work stream that Matthias presented. It was the development of the analytical method. And so it has been established by the IFRA Analytical Working Group, and it's available publicly on the IFRA website. And in the meantime, we have also conducted a proficiency test on this furocoumarin analytical method. Matthias, if you want to complement.
I fully agree with what you stated, Jennifer.
Okay, very good. So that information, it does exist and can be found on the IFRA website then. So then coming a question from Axel Penven. Did you develop a method to test the amount of furocoumarin in a final cosmetic product? As far as I know, the current method is only for raw materials. It would be better to have the same method to test for authorities and companies. So,
yeah, I mean that's maybe Jennifer, if you want to take it on again.
You can do it, Matthias.
I
We
mean,
just give the answer.
yeah, as I hope we would give the same answer. In our test method development scope is and has always been, because that's a product we are responsible for, the raw materials and the fragrance mixtures which we supply to the customers. Finished products are not in our scope, and actually we as fragrance industry should not develop analytical methods for finished consumer products. That's in the scope and the remit of the consumer product industry, and certainly they will look on to which extent the methodology out there is applicable, and very often it's mainly linked to the extraction process and procedure. But again, this is not and has never been the scope of the fragrance industry. So that's the explanation. Jennifer, would you agree or build on it?
Yeah, no, it's
Thank you.
same.
okay, thank you. We have two questions from Sabrina Fumingali. Hello. Would there also be alignment with the European cosmetics regulation in terms of which furocoumarins to be considered, brackets, the list? And there's equally a question from the same person. Do you confirm that body mist will not be exempted from the 1 part per million limit in the Swiss regulation?
I don't know who wants to start on the first one. I mean, the EU regulation is not under review. So what we have defined is the way we want to implement the IFRA policy. And as we try to explain, that happened along discussion and exchanges with the cosmetic regulators in Switzerland, which have decided to agree with our list of markers. There is no debate ongoing with regard to the EU cosmetic regulation at this moment in time, so the regulation in the EU stays as it is. If there would ever be any revision, we don't know if they would look at what's out there and they might take our example. But no, there is no alignment happening simply because there is no revision ongoing of the EU cosmetic regulation. But the two markers in the EU cosmetic regulation relevant for furocoumarin presence in cosmetic products are also in our list of markers. There is a third marker which, to our understanding, is actually not relevant at all, trioxylan, for extracts used in our industry. And I don't know who wants to take on the second one on the body mist. I really need to think about it. Maybe that's something I would suggest that we follow up with Ms. Fumagalli, if she maybe just simply sends on her email address to us, because I don't have in my mind all the exemptions, and there's actually no, at this moment in time, no written rationale for the Swiss regulatory exemptions. And we would need to look how we ourselves would interpret that case of a body mist. So maybe that's something we can follow up in writing.
Yes, indeed. And if there are any questions that come up afterwards, or indeed that we can't answer right today, all participants are kindly invited to write to info@ifrafragrance.org, and questions that we can answer, we will try and do so in the coming days. This also would be the answer I would give to the person who has asked if we will already officially communicate on this proposal. Bear in mind that this is also us speaking publicly on the furocoumarins policy, but the official standard, of course, will be published with the 50 seconds. So, but if any questions about the timeline can also be found on the website, and if it's not there, you can also ask us at that email address, which again is info@ifrafragrance.org. Now let's move to another question, another anonymous attendee regarding analytical methods. Is it a requirement to implement the method exactly as outlined in the IFRA publication, or are laboratories free to use alternative validated methodologies?
Jennifer, you want to do that, or you want me?
You can do it.
Well, again, I'm going to give a statement, and please
Yeah.
feel free to correct me. But any method available in-house that leads to reliable results can be used. I mean, the IFRA method is a guidance and a method specifically in the absence of companies having their own in-house method. But whatever works, whatever sophisticated approach companies might have in place to reliably determine and quantify furocoumarins can be used. It's a reference method, nothing else and nothing less.
That's good. Thank you. Very clear. Now another one from Gus Romero. In the context of fine fragrance, would the addition of UV filters for stability purposes move the formulation into more restricted levels under the new guidelines? A nice complicated one. Who would like to take that?
Well, I can start with it, and if you'd like to, anyone from the IFRA staff jump in. One of the details in the slides I had included a footnote that we strongly recommend including in the IFRA certificate. And the current wording that we were working with, and I'll read it out here, but again, you can trace back on the presentation. The intention, right, that the 1 ppm limit for furocoumarin content is to apply to leave-on products with a higher risk potential resulting from prolonged exposure to natural or artificial UV light, such as sunscreen products or other or other products marketed specifically for exposure to natural artificial UV light. So in some existing regulations, these products have been referred to as sun protection and bronzing products. We said that the circumstances when the lower limit apply could be visible from the product presentation or by claiming an SPF on the product. So I would say, again, it would come back to product claims and the foreseeable use, not necessarily the full ingredient listing. And again, in any questions or concerns, I would best recommend a close dialogue between fragrance supplier and consumer product company.
Anyone else?
I fully agree with you, Jennifer. I mean, the way it was described here, if it's only for product stabilization and there's no claims coming along, as you mentioned, I wouldn't see the need to move to the 1 ppm.
Good. Thank you. I think that question has been answered then. I think an easy one probably for Jennifer from IFRA. When do the IFRA 51 safety assessments lose their validity, if ever?
So here we are talking about not safety assessment, but risk management. So IFRA 51st should be fully implemented in October, end of October 2025. That's why 52nd amendment will not be notified before that date. They do not lose their validity. An amendment, so for instance, the 52nd amendment, what will happen? It will include new standard, so for new material, or you could also have revised standard. In case of a revised standard, then you need to apply the revision. But all the standard that has been published before with 51st or 50th or 49, they are still valid. Matthias, I guess. Yeah, okay.
Nothing to add. Perfect. Couldn't have explained it better.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. We've run out of content questions. I'll leave a few minutes left for people to put any burning questions that remain. In the meantime, the final question that we actually have on stage here is, will it be possible to receive a copy of this presentation? I think we need I think we can probably publish this, but we'll need to confer. Nevertheless, the final version of this video will be made available to all attendees and eventually made public. As attendees, you do get the time, you get the benefit of having watched it live, and you'll receive it sooner. It won't go public until later. I take this opportunity to remind people that if they have any follow-up questions, they can write to us afterwards in info@ifrafragrance.org. But if you want your question answered now, this is the last opportunity to do so. There's only 5 minutes left scheduled for the webinar anyway. If I don't see any others come up, I will leave a few seconds for my colleagues if they have any final remarks before the webinar closes. Matthias, Jennifer?
Maybe I would just pick up on the question that is still on there before thanking the participants for their interest. We will broadly communicate continuously on this policy change. And this was the first step to go public broadly. But on that specific standard and that specific policy, we will broadly communicate even ahead of the official consultation so that the supply chain is aware and informed, given the complexity of it and the challenge of the implementation.
Okay, thank you, Matthias. That adds a little bit of context. Now, we have as a result of our call for a final question, received one final question. So now we have to do the honourable thing and actually answer it. I will read it out loud. This will be the last question for the webinar. Following the previous question about UV filter as stabilizer for facial cream used in the morning, which is an application that could actually leave to sunlight all day, should the 1 part per million be considered or 5 parts per million be considered, even though SPF is not claimed? Jennifer Chiara, that might be for you, I suspect.
I think this could be another example where it would definitely be best served to kind of exchange between the fragrance supplier and the consumer goods company, because we are considering concepts like intended and foreseeable use. In case the consumer goods company has more specific exposure data connected to the product that could be helpful to consider. I'm not so sure if this would be something that IFRA would kind of put down a hard rule on. I mean, it's definitely a good question.
I would maybe only compliment that the 5 ppm limit is also considering UV
Correct.
exposure
Yes.
and giving sufficient safety. It's an additional factor for prolonged, as Jennifer just pointed out, prolonged and intentional exposure to sunlight. But again, she's right. Some of these products might be a bit tricky to assess.
Okay, so there's still some areas where it can be discussed between the client and the producer. Good. Okay, well, with that, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the 350 people who took the time to join us this afternoon. We're seeing a lot of interest in not just this topic, but others. And so we do appreciate your taking the time, and we will, of course, copy you in when there are future webinars of this type in public. In the meantime, then, it remains for me to thank Matthias Vey, Scientific Director, Scientific Vice President for IFRA, Jennifer Dortz, Scientific Affairs Manager for IFRA, and Jennifer Cocchiara from DSM Firmenich, the Risk Management Task Force Chair. Again, if there are any questions that remain after this, please do not hesitate to write to us at the address I've now repeated several times. And I wish you all a very, very pleasant afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.